Most of 19th century poetry is mostly composed of either romanticism or transcendentalist ideals, well, romanticist. Both of those include the exploration of death, the rejection of more Puritan, slightly more older traditional ideals, and the acceptance of other ideologies or beliefs such as Shinto Buddhism and Hinduism, mainly those of Eastern culture or descent. Um, Among the most prominent writers of the 19th century poetry that embodies those ideals is Emily Dickinson, and a lot of those ideals, such as entropy or longing for nature, that are shown in romanticism or transcendentalism, are evident in her poem A Certain Slant of Light.
The main ideas of the poem revolve around the effect of a certain kind of light that the speaker notices on winter afternoons. We notice the key theme of oppression straight from the first stanza, as we are told how the light oppresses. The kind of oppression, however, is described throughout the rest of the poem, where in the first stanza it is described as like the heft of cathedral tunes. This is an unconventional simile for oppression, showing it is a more complicated oppression than we are used to seeing. The theme continues into the second stanza, where the light is determined as leaving a heavenly hurt that causes no visible damage as it leaves no scar, but instead causes a mental or spiritual change or internal indifference that is described in this instance. This leads on to the common theme of transformation or change that is usually seen in Dickens's poetry, this usually being a change in perspective or thought, with it described in this instance as an imperial affliction. Finally, we see the theme of nature, with the power of the light suggesting that nature knows its presence, as Dickinson describes as how when the light comes, the landscape listens. Furthermore, the final theme of death, seen in nearly all Dickinson poetry, is shown, where she describes how when the light fades, it is like the distance on the look of death.
The structure in Emily Dickinson's poems is composed of two parts. The first part being prominent in the first and fourth stanza, being mainly composed of observation, which is prominent in her nature poems. But weirdly, this poem is a hybrid. It both has elements that are indicative of her entropic poetry, that is, where she talks about death and the afterlife, and both of her nature poetry, which is mainly about observing, such as a bird came down the walk. This gives a sort of insight as to what the poem might actually be about, which could be the death of nature. More specifically, the death of nature that comes at the beginning of winter, as is indicated by winter afternoons. This might be her longing for summer and how sadly she misses the point in time at which during a year everything is green, whereas in winter everything is dead, dying, or is completely inactive.
The turning point in the poem is just after the third stanza, where Emily Dickinson stops with her reflective approach and turns to a more observational approach. For example, Dickinson looks more closely at the oppression's relationship with death, and in this fourth stanza it looks as though the speaker is finally turning to death. At this final point, this observation shows that death and life are also quite